Roy Maddox was 73 and had spent 4 decades shaping glass into things built to last. Vera was 71 and had cooked professionally for 32 of those same years. They had been married for 49 years and had never looked at a bad idea without looking it in the eye. That spring they paid $800 for the old Calloway Diner on Route 9. The auction room went quiet, and then it did not stay quiet. Mayor Harlan Briggs called the Pell Creek Courier that afternoon. The paper ran his words the next morning as a warning to anyone who thought $800 bought something worth having. Roy read the paper and looked at Vera. He said she should hold off on the kitchen until he had checked the floors. Vera said she had already checked the floors. What they found beneath those floors had not seen daylight in 40 years. 11 months later, Mayor Briggs drove back out to Route 9. He did not come empty-handed, but I need to take you back to the beginning. The auction for the Calloway Diner on Route 9 was held on a Wednesday morning in the back room of the Pell Creek courthouse, and it was the kind of auction where nobody expected anything to actually sell. The diner had been closed for 22 years. It had sat along the shoulder of Route 9 long enough that most people in Pell Creek had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a tree stump or a rusted fence post. It was just there. It had been there so long that the closing felt like ancient history, and the building itself felt like part of the landscape, permanent and rotting, and somehow both at once. The county had been trying to offload it for 3 years. The property included the diner building, a narrow strip of crumbling parking lot, and a wedge of overgrown land behind the structure that ran down to a drainage ditch. The listing sheet, which Roy had folded and refolded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, described the property as a 1947 commercial building with significant deferred maintenance, a compromised roof section over the eastern dining room, and a grease trap that had not been serviced since the previous century. The asking price at the start of the auction was $4,000. By the time Roy and Vera walked in, the room held maybe 12 people. A few were there for the other lots on the docket. A few were there the way people attend small auctions in small towns for the entertainment of watching other people make decisions. The auctioneer, a thin man named Gus who wore the same brown blazer to every county auction Roy had ever attended, looked up when they came in and said nothing. Vera found 2 chairs near the back. Roy stood a moment looking at the listing sheet, even though he had already memorized it. The Calloway Diner lot came up third. Nobody bid at $4,000. Nobody bid at $3,000. Gus dropped it to $2.5, and there was silence. He dropped it to $2,000, and a woman near the front shook her head slightly, like she was answering a question nobody had asked. Then Roy raised his hand at $800. The room did not react the way rooms react in movies. There was no outburst, no laughter. It was quieter than that. One of the men near the front turned to look at Roy the way you look at someone who has spoken in a foreign language. Gus said sold, his gavel came down, and that was the whole of it. Vera was already writing when Roy sat back down beside her. Not in a notepad, in their notebook. A black hardcover composition book they had kept together since their first year of marriage. Half Roy's handwriting on the left-hand pages and half Vera's on the right-hand pages. 49 years of the 2 of them in one continuous record. Things they had decided together. Things they had seen. Things they needed to remember. She wrote the date and the amount and the address, then drew a small rectangle to represent the building, and beneath it she wrote 2 words. Finally stopped. Roy looked at what she had written and did not say anything. He did not need to. They had driven past the Calloway Diner on Route 9 more times than either of them could count across 49 years of marriage. In the early years, before Nathan was born, they had taken long Sunday afternoon drives east out of Pell Creek along Route 9 through 3 counties and back around through a different set of roads. The Calloway had always looked like exactly the right kind of place. The kind that served good pie and asked nothing of you, and where you could sit at the counter and talk or not talk, and both were acceptable. But they had always been going somewhere, or coming back from somewhere, and the stopping had never quite happened. The diner closed in 2002. Roy and Vera had been married 29 years by then and had still never stopped. The drive from the courthouse to Route 9 took 11 minutes. Roy drove. Vera held the listing sheet in her lap and did not look at it because she had read it enough times. The building came into view around a long bend in the road, and even at a distance you could see it was not good. The roof had gone gray and the eastern section sagged where the listing sheet had warned it would. The parking lot had heaved and cracked, and grass was pushing through the asphalt in long, unruly lines. The sign above the door had lost all its original lettering except for the C and the 2 lowercase letters that had once been part of Calloway. Roy pulled into the lot, and they both sat for a moment looking at it through the windshield. Roy had spent 40 years working with glass. He had trained as a traditional glazier in his 20s, moved into architectural stained glass in his 30s, and spent the last decade of his working life doing restoration on historic buildings across 6 states. He had put his hands inside a lot of structures that other people had written off, and he had learned to read them the way some people read faces. He knew the difference between a building that was defeated and a building that was merely tired. Defeat settled into the foundation. Fatigue was just in the surface of things. He got out and Vera got out behind him, and they walked the perimeter together. The parking lot gave way to the narrow rear lot, entirely overgrown, and beyond the overgrowth was the slope down to the drainage ditch. The slope faced north. Roy noted that without writing it down, Vera tried the back door of the kitchen. It opened. The county had not bothered to relock it after the last inspection. Inside, the kitchen smelled the way all old commercial kitchens smell when they have been closed long enough. Grease and thyme and the ghost of whatever the last thing cooked had been, 22 years ago, and still somehow present. Vera stood in the middle of the kitchen floor and turned in a slow circle. The range hood was intact. The prep surfaces were surface rusted but solid beneath the rust. The walk-in had been emptied of its contents long ago, but the compressor housing was still there. Vera put her palm flat on a prep counter and pressed down, and it did not move. She pressed harder. It still did not move. Roy was already in the main dining room. He had a flashlight, even though there was enough light from the front windows because he always carried a flashlight in old buildings. He was on his knees near the baseboard when Vera came through. She asked what he was looking at. He said the original counter was still in there. The whole thing, under about 4 layers of paint and a veneer, overlay someone had installed in the 1980s, but it was still in there. He could see the profile of the original woodwork at the base where the overlay met the floor. And the profile was not the profile of standard commercial counter construction. Vera looked at the counter for a moment. Then she looked at the dining room windows. 3 had been boarded with plywood. The remaining 2 were intact, and in the afternoon light the space was dim and warm, and looked like a place where good things had once happened to ordinary people. She said she thought they should probably talk about the floors before they talked about anything else. Roy said he was aware of the floors. They stood in the old dining room of the Calloway Diner in the particular silence of 2 people who are both looking at the same invisible thing from the same angle, and neither of them said another word about it that afternoon, because there was nothing left to say about a decision that had already been made before the auctioneer's gavel had finished coming down. Mayor Harlan Briggs had been mayor of Pell Creek for 11 years and had in that time developed a particular talent for identifying which stories the town needed to hear and which stories the town needed to be protected from. He had made his call to the Pell Creek Courier from the front seat of his car before Roy and Vera had finished their first walkthrough of the property on Route 9. The headline in the next morning's edition was not cruel in any sophisticated way. It was worse than that. It was reasonable. County couple acquires Route 9 property for $800. Mayor Briggs notes decades of deferred maintenance as cautionary tale for prospective auction buyers. The story was 4 paragraphs. The 4th paragraph quoted Briggs directly. He said he respected the Maddoxes as long-time Pell Creek residents, and hoped they understood the scope of what they had taken on. He said the county had attempted for 3 years to find a buyer for that particular property, and that the price point alone communicated everything a potential investor needed to understand about its condition. He said he would be surprised if they recouped their investment, and that he offered that observation with genuine kindness. He meant it kindly. Vera read the article at the kitchen table with her morning coffee, and then set it down and picked up her mug with both hands, and held it the way she held things when something was sitting with her. Roy read it standing at the counter in the kitchen of their house, and folded it once and set it on the counter, and went to get his coat. Nathan called that evening. He was their only child, and he lived in Cincinnati, 3 states away from Pell Creek. He was 51 years old, and worked in logistics, and had a gift for identifying when a situation was about to become more complicated than it needed to be. He asked his mother what exactly they were thinking. He used the word exactly twice in the first 2 minutes. Vera told him they were thinking of reopening the diner. The pause that followed was Nathan collecting himself. He asked if they had any idea what a commercial kitchen renovation cost in the current market. He asked if Roy had talked to a structural engineer. He asked what Roy was planning to do with 40 years of accumulated grease and a compromised roof. Vera told him Roy was not planning to do anything with accumulated grease. She told him Roy was planning to restore the original counter, which had art glass running its entire length, and which someone had covered over in 1983 who had no idea what they were looking at. Nathan said he did not know what that meant for the overall project. Vera said she needed to finish her list and thanked him for calling. In town, the story moved the way small-town stories move, which is to say quickly and with some predictable distortion. Lou Petty, who had run the hardware store on Broad Street for many years before it closed, told 3 separate people that it was a shame to see a nice couple's retirement savings go into something the county had given up on. Connie Marsh at the pharmacy said she felt genuinely bad for them. Ray DeLuca at the filling station said he had heard Roy used to do glass work and could not figure out what glass work had to do with a condemned diner on Route 9. The overall consensus of Pell Creek was not hostile. It was something more familiar than hostility. It was pity, which is its own kind of harder to carry. Roy heard most of it second-hand through Bet Larkin at the hardware store, who relayed it with the specific flatness of a person who is sharing information without endorsing it. Roy thanked her and did not respond to any of it because he had never found a useful way to respond to pity that came from people who had not looked at the thing you were looking at. You could not argue with their conclusion because their conclusion was reasonable from where they stood. You could only go back to the property and let the property settle the question. He and Vera drove out to Route 9 every morning that first week with coffee and travel mugs and the notebook and a set of lists that Vera had organized by trade and by priority and by what could and could not be deferred. Roy moved through the building with a notepad and a measuring tape and a flashlight and the methodical patience of a man who had been doing this kind of work for 4 decades. Vera moved through the kitchen with a legal pad and her own flashlight, and the specific expression she got when she was building something inside her head that she was not yet ready to put into words. They did not talk much on those first drives. They had been married long enough that the talking was not always the important part. They started the real work in the second week. Roy's first task was structural, because nothing else could happen until the structure was understood. He hired a structural engineer named Pete Kimball, who drove out from Hartwell and spent a full day walking every square foot of the building in the careful way of someone who has seen many buildings fail and has no interest in being surprised. Pete told Roy the building was sound where it counted and compromised where it didn't, and that the roof over the eastern section needed full resheathing, but the framing and the foundation were good. He said the foundation was better than good. He said whoever had poured it in 1947 had understood their soil. Roy thanked him and paid him, and Pete drove away, and Roy stood outside the building for a moment, looking at it in the afternoon light. Then he went back in. He started with the roof because everything else depended on the roof. He was not a young man, and he knew it. He paced himself across the days, which Vera monitored from the ground and occasionally commented on without being asked, in the ways she had been commenting on things for 49 years, which was directly and without cruelty, and usually correct. He got the resheathing done in 10 days of morning work, leaving the afternoons for interior assessment. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that nobody would ever see or remark on, or know was there, which was fine with Roy. In his experience, that described most of the important work in any building. While Roy was on the roof in the mornings, Vera was in the kitchen. She had run the kitchen at a Hartwell house in Hartwell for 28 years, from the time she was 39 until she was 67. Hartwell House had served 240 covers on a busy Friday night, and Vera had run its kitchen with the authority of someone who had worked every station in it before she ran any of them. She knew what proper equipment sounded like and what failing equipment pretended to sound like. She had not cooked professionally since retiring 4 years ago, but her hands had not forgotten 32 years of prep work. You do not forget that. The knowledge lives below the thinking part of you, in the part that moves first. The Calloway's kitchen was not impossible. It was dirty in the way of a space closed without being properly cleaned for the last time, out of date in its equipment, and the grease trap was a full project in itself. But the layout was sound. The bones of it were right. Vera could see what it had been and what it wanted to be, and the distance between those two things was work. She started with a deep clean that took 4 days and left her hands raw and her notes extensive. Then she began a systematic assessment of every piece of equipment, every surface, every supply line. She wrote everything in the notebook on her right-hand pages in the tight, organized columns she used when she was being precise. Roy's left-hand pages had measurements and sketches. Together, the pages formed a complete map of what the building needed and in what sequence. On the 9th day of that second week, a truck pulled into the parking lot, and a woman got out and stood looking at the building for a moment before coming in. Her name was Bet Larkin. She ran Larkin's Hardware on Maple Street in Pell Creek and had been running it since her father retired in 1991. She was 64 years old and wore paint-stained work pants and a flannel shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, regardless of what the weather outside was doing, and she had driven out to Route 9 because she had heard Roy Maddox had bought the Calloway and was working on it, and she wanted to see it for herself before she formed an opinion. She walked the length of the dining room slowly and stopped at the counter. Roy had begun carefully removing a test section of the overlay veneer near the end closest to the windows, using a heat gun and a set of thin pry tools from a case he kept in his truck. Beneath the removed section, the edge of something was just visible, dark with grime, but there. Betty asked him what that was. Roy told her it was the original art glass counter insert, commissioned by the original owner of the Calloway when the building was constructed in 1947. He had found a photograph of the counter in the County Historical Archive. The photograph was in black and white, which had not captured what the glass actually was, but you could see the light it was throwing, and you could understand from that what the glass itself must have been. Betty stood at the counter for a long time, looking at the exposed edge. Then she said she had 6 bottles of the best glass cleaner in Pell Creek County back at the store, and she would bring them out the following morning. She was back at 7:30 with the cleaner, a case of lint-free cloths, and a small articulating work light that she said was the best thing she owned for close work in dim spaces. She set them on the counter and said she had nothing pressing until noon if Roy needed an extra set of hands. Roy said he could always use an extra set of hands. Bet stayed until 2 in the afternoon and came back the next day at 7:30 again. The first small victory came at the end of the 3rd week. Roy had cleaned and revealed an 18-inch section of the glass insert near the window end of the counter where the afternoon light came in longest. He had worked through it layer by layer over 3 days, removing the grime the way he removed grime from all historic glass, with patience and no assumptions, because you did not push historic glass. You let it tell you what it was. When he finally cleared the last film from the 18-inch section and held Bet's articulating light beneath it from below the counter, the glass threw color across the far wall of the dining room. Amber and green and a warm, deep blue that neither of them had expected. It moved up the wall in a band of shifting light the way no ordinary diner counter had any business producing. Vera came in from the kitchen because she had heard Roy go quiet, and she knew the specific quality of that quiet, which was different from his ordinary quiet in a way she could not have described to anyone who had not spent 49 years listening to him. She stood beside Roy and looked at the wall where the light was moving. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said she thought they might need to reconsider the paint colors. Roy said he thought she was right about that. They stood in the old dining room of the Calloway Diner with the afternoon light coming through the one unboarded window and Bet's work light throwing amber and green and deep blue across the far wall. And the building was still in every practical sense a construction project, and neither of them were thinking about that at all. The floors had been an ongoing subject between Roy and Vera for 3 weeks. The dining room floor was original to the building, which meant commercial-grade linoleum tile over a plank subfloor, and the linoleum had not been replaced in at least 30 years and had lifted in some sections and gone soft beneath the foot, in others in a way that was not alarming, but was not nothing either. Roy had mapped the soft zones on his notepad and had been planning to pull the linoleum to assess the subfloor by the end of the month. Vera had been saying they should pull it sooner. On the morning of the 22nd day, Roy started pulling the linoleum. He began in the section toward the back of the dining room where the softness had been most pronounced, and within 30 minutes of work he had a section of subfloor exposed and visible. The planks were sound. He had prepared himself for compromise and found none. But where he had expected to find a concrete slab beneath the planks, he found something else. There was a door in the floor. It was set into the subfloor between 2 of the main joists, a heavy wooden hatch with a recessed iron ring handle, and it had been there long enough that the surrounding planks had been notched and fitted precisely to accommodate it. It was not an addition. It had been built in. Whoever had framed this floor had known the hatch was there and had constructed around it rather than over it. Roy called Vera. She came from the kitchen and crouched beside him and looked at the hatch for a moment without touching it. He said he did not know what was under there. She said she had a feeling. He lifted the ring handle and pulled. The hatch had not been opened in a very long time, and it resisted in the particular way of things that have been sealed long enough to forget they were meant to open. Then it gave all at once with a sound like a long breath releasing, and a wave of cold air came up from below. Cold. Not the damp cold of a basement. Not the still cold of an unventilated crawl space. Clean cold, the kind that comes from a space that has been correctly engineered and consistently maintained by physics, rather than by anyone's intention or attention. Roy shone his flashlight down. The stairs were wood, solid and straight. The space below was roughly 12 feet square, built from poured concrete with a brick interior lining on 3 of its 4 walls. The ceiling height was 7 feet. Heavy timber shelving ran along 2 walls, built to hold significant weight. The floor was smooth concrete. The temperature in the space was, by Roy's estimate, somewhere around 48 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been built as a cold storage room, not an afterthought, a proper one, engineered at the same time as the building above it by someone who understood the thermodynamics of what they were doing. The brick lining on 3 walls provided insulation. The 4th wall, the one that backed against the cool north-facing slope of the property behind the building, was poured concrete in direct contact with the earth, providing thermal mass. Passive refrigeration of the traditional kind, the engineering that predated mechanical refrigeration and that, when built correctly, simply worked because the laws of physics do not require electricity. It had been working for 77 years. Nobody had opened it in 40 of them. Roy went down first and then steadied the stairs for Vera, and she came down and turned in the slow circle she turned when she was reading a space. Roy put his hand on the brick wall. Dry. The mortar was intact, no moisture damage, no mineral bloom on the brick face. The seal had held. Vera ran her hand along one of the timber shelves. The wood was cold and hard and completely sound. She said she knew what this was for. Roy said he thought she probably did. She said that if they opened the exterior-facing concrete wall to the slope behind the building, the way the original engineering intended, the room would drop another 4 to 6 degrees through the summer and maintain that temperature year-round without mechanical assistance. With proper ventilation management, this room could function as a working cold storage facility in active commercial use. She had read about cellars of this design in the records of rural American restaurants from the era before reliable mechanical refrigeration, when a diner operator had to solve his own infrastructure problems or go without. She said she thought Emmett Calloway had known exactly what he was building beneath his floor in 1947, and that the person who nailed that hatch, shut 40 years later, had not. Roy looked at the shelves and then at Vera, and then at the stairs rising back up to the dining room. He said she should probably go get the notebook. She was already going. She came back down with the notebook and her pen, and Roy held the flashlight while she wrote on her right-hand pages, and he sketched on his left, and they stood in the cold room beneath the floor of the Calloway Diner and filled 3 pages with what they were looking at and what it could become. If you have made it this far into Roy and Vera's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. They brought Pete Kimball back to look at the cold room. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and turned in the same slow circle Vera had turned, and then stood quietly looking at the brick walls. He said it was the finest example of vernacular passive cold storage engineering he had encountered outside of a textbook. He said the man who built the Calloway in 1947 had understood something about his specific site that nobody had looked for in the 77 years since. He said if they opened the earth-facing wall correctly and maintained the drainage slope, the room would function as designed. He said he could not state what this was worth, but he was certain it was not nothing. Roy thanked him and paid him, and Pete left. That evening, Roy and Vera sat on 2 folding chairs in the parking lot of the Calloway with coffee from Vera's thermos and the light going flat over Route 9, and Roy opened the notebook to a clean left-hand page and sketched the cold room from memory, the stairs and the shelves and the brick walls and the north-facing concrete wall and the slope of the hillside behind it. Vera watched him draw. She said she thought the cold room changed what the diner could be, not what it had been. What it could become. Something nobody else was doing, not because they lacked the skill, but because they lacked the room. A menu built around what that space could hold and how it held it. Produce stored at the temperatures produce needed before the convenience of mechanical refrigeration taught everyone to settle for less. Sourced locally, held correctly, brought to the table the way food was meant to arrive, as something that had been cared for at every stage. Roy put down his pen and looked at what he had sketched. He said that was an exceptionally good idea. She said she was aware of that. He said he had always known she was a good cook. She said she was an exceptional cook, and he had always known that too, and she accepted his understatement in the spirit in which it was offered. He said that was generous of her. She poured more coffee for both of them without asking if he wanted it. The code enforcement notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 5th week. It came from the County Building Division, and it referenced 4 items. The roof replacement was improperly permitted, which surprised Roy because he had pulled the permit before starting and had posted it correctly. The grease trap remediation had not been completed to current county standards. The cold storage room, now that it had apparently come to the county's attention, required a structural assessment and access compliance review, and the parking lot surface damage was flagged as requiring remediation before the property could operate commercially. Roy read the notice twice, and then called Pete Kimball. Pete told him he had not filed anything official. He said he had mentioned the cold room to Mayor Briggs at the feed store because Briggs had asked directly how the Maddox project was going, and Pete had answered honestly. He said he was sorry and had not anticipated it going anywhere official. Roy thanked him and said nothing further about it. he told Vera that evening. She listened and then looked back at her notes. She said they should handle the grease trap first. She said Roy needed to find the permit discrepancy before the end of the week. She said the cold room compliance review was not a problem. A formal structural assessment of a passive cold storage system would produce documentation that could become part of the permanent record of what the room was. She said they should request an engineer with specific experience in historic construction. Roy said he had been thinking the same thing. She said she figured he had. He corrected the permit the following afternoon, finding that a single page had been filed with the wrong parcel designation, a clerical error from a day when too many things were happening at once. He refiled it the same afternoon. A grease trap company came out Thursday and confirmed the remediation could be completed in 2 weeks. Roy called the county and requested the cold room assessment be assigned to an engineer with documented experience in historic structural systems. The name they were given was Patricia Holt from the State Historic Preservation Division. She drove out from the state capitol on a Friday morning and parked in the lot and stood looking at the Calloway building for a full 30 seconds before she went inside. She was in her early 50s and wore field clothes and carried a bag that made a professional sound when she set it down. She went below with Roy and Vera and spent 40 minutes in the cold room with a measuring tape and a camera and a notebook considerably larger than theirs. She photographed the brick lining and the timber shelving and the ceiling and the smooth concrete floor and the stairs and the exterior-facing wall where the soil contact was closest. She opened the exterior section Roy had already begun to modify and measured the slope and the orientation of the land. When she came back up, she sat on a stool in the dining room and wrote for several minutes without speaking. Then she said this was a 1947 passive cold storage system, and it was the finest example of vernacular commercial cold storage engineering she had personally encountered in 16 years of fieldwork for the state. She said it was of genuine historic interest and that she intended to begin a formal assessment process for state historic designation. She said the compliance review would not be a problem. She said she needed to make a few calls and that she might need to come back. Roy said she was welcome at any time. She drove back to the state capitol, and Roy and Vera stood in the dining room in the light, coming through the restored windows, and throwing the first cleaned section of the art glass against the far wall in amber and green and deep blue. And neither of them said anything for a moment because sometimes the moment does not need words to know what it is. Roy said he thought they had done enough for one day. Vera said they had barely started. He made the coffee anyway. The first person to come without being invited was Lou Petty. He pulled into the parking lot on a Saturday morning in the 8th week and sat in his truck for a few minutes before getting out. Roy saw him through the dining room window and went to the door. Lou was 68 years old and had spent his working life in hardware in Pell Creek, first for Bet's father and later for himself until his own shop closed in 2017. He and Roy had known each other for 30 years without ever being close, in the way of men in a small town who know each other's names and histories without knowing each other. Lou said he was just driving past and thought he would stop. Roy said, "Come in." Lou walked the length of the dining room and stopped at the counter. By the 8th week, Roy had cleared and restored the full 16 feet of the art glass counter insert, working from the window end to the wall end, in a process that had taken him 6 careful days. The glass was fully revealed now, running the entire length of the counter in a continuous band 8 inches wide, set into the original hardwood counter surface that Roy had also stripped and refinished. The glass was amber and green and deep blue, and a warm amber gold that caught the light differently depending on the angle and the hour, so that the counter looked slightly different at 7 in the morning than it did at noon, and entirely different again in the late afternoon when the western light came through. Lou stood at the counter for a long time without saying anything. Then he said he had eaten at the Calloway, probably 200 times before it closed. He said he had sat at that counter more times than he could count. He said he had never once seen that. Roy said nobody had, since 1983. Lou looked at Roy and then back at the glass. He said it was something. He said he was using that word specifically and meant it. Roy said he knew. Lou asked if there was anything he could help with. Roy said they were turning attention to the parking lot asphalt next, and that a plate compactor would be useful if Lou happened to know of one available to borrow. Lou said he had one in his garage that Roy could use as long as he needed. Roy said he was grateful for that. Lou left and came back 2 hours later with the compactor in his truck bed and helped Roy unload it without being asked. Nathan came on a weekend in the 9th week. He drove down from Cincinnati on a Friday evening, and they had dinner at the Sunrise Diner on Broad Street. He was polite and worried, and working not to let the worry show, in the way of a man who has learned by 51 that showing worry to his mother produces results he cannot anticipate. Saturday morning they drove out to Route 9. Nathan stood in the parking lot and looked at the building. The roof was finished. Every window was reglazed. The exterior had been cleaned and the parking lot repaved. The building was not finished, but it had stopped looking like something the county was trying to give away, and it started looking like something someone believed in. Inside, Nathan stood at the counter and looked at the full length of the glass. He was quiet for a long time. He asked how Roy had known it was there. Roy said he had seen the profile of the original woodwork at the baseboard and made a reasonable inference. Nathan nodded and walked the full length of the counter with his hands in his pockets. He asked if he could see the cold room. Roy took him down. Nathan stood in the cold space with his phone's flashlight on the brick walls and the timber shelves, and did not speak for a full minute. He put his hand on the brick the way Roy had the first time. He asked what the temperature was. Roy told him 46 degrees at that hour. When they came back up, Nathan looked at his parents standing together by the counter and said he owed them an apology. Roy said he did not. Vera said she accepted it. Nathan laughed despite himself, and Roy smiled, and Vera went for the thermos because she had known they would need coffee at some point in this conversation. Addie Crane from the Pell Creek Courier called Roy in the 10th week. She was 26 and had been covering the county for 8 months without a story she found genuinely interesting. She had heard about the cold room through Patricia Holt, whose mention of the Calloway to a colleague had eventually traveled back through a former Pell Creek resident to Addie's desk. She asked if she could come out. Roy said yes. She came on a Tuesday and stayed 4 hours. She photographed the counter glass in the cold room and Roy at the last window, and Vera in the kitchen explaining what the menu would do and why the cold room made it possible. She asked good questions and wrote in a small spiral notebook and did not pretend to expertise she did not have. She asked Roy how he had known the glass would be worth saving. He said he had not known. He had suspected. "There is a difference," he said. "Knowing is only the end of suspecting when the evidence has finally accumulated to a point you can no longer argue with." She wrote that down. Mayor Harlan Briggs drove past the Calloway on Route 9 twice in the 10th week. Roy saw his car the second time, slowing near the lot entrance and then continuing without stopping. Addie Crane's story ran in the Pell Creek Courier on a Thursday morning in the 12th week. It was the front page. The headline was, "Pell Creek Couple's $800 Diner Hides 40-Year Secret." The story ran 22 column inches with 3 photographs. The largest was the art glass counter catching the afternoon light and throwing it across the far wall of the dining room in amber and green and deep blue. The second was the cold room, taken from the top of the stairs with a wide lens so you could see the full depth of the space and the brick walls and the timber shelves and understand what you were looking at. The third was Roy and Vera standing together at the counter, not posed, caught mid-conversation the way Addie had caught them when they were not thinking about being photographed. Roy had his hand flat on the counter near the glass. Vera was looking at Roy with an expression that anyone who knew her recognized as the expression she used when he was saying something she had already thought of. The story was picked up by the State Wire before noon. By the following Monday, it had been taken by 2 regional outlets in adjacent states and by a national feature syndicate that reached every major market in the country. Patricia Holt called Roy on the Thursday the story ran. She said her office had received 3 inquiries from architectural history researchers about the cold room before 10 in the morning. She said she was proceeding with the formal assessment for state historic designation and that he should expect attention from academic quarters in the coming weeks. Roy said he would do his best to be ready. She said she was not sure anyone could fully prepare for it. The transformation of the Courier's front page was not lost on anyone in Pell Creek who had read the original Cautionary tale story 10 weeks earlier. Bet Larkin bought 6 copies of the new edition and left them on the hardware store counter without comment. Lou Petty showed the story to every person who came into his garage that week. Connie Marsh at the pharmacy put a copy in the window. Mayor Harlan Briggs came to the diner. He pulled into the parking lot on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the soft opening and sat in his car for a moment before getting out. Roy was inside working on the final details of the booth cushion covers, which Bet had brought fabric for, and Vera was in the kitchen running a full test of the menu with Bet assisting and offering opinions on everything without restraint. Roy saw Briggs through the window and set down his work and went to the door. Briggs came in. He stood in the doorway for a moment and then walked to the counter and looked at the glass. The full length of it was lit by the morning light from the newly glazed windows. The amber and green and deep blue threw across the far wall in a band that moved slightly as the clouds moved outside. Briggs stood at the counter for a long time. He said it was remarkable work. Roy thanked him. Briggs said he owed Roy and Vera an acknowledgement. He said he had caused a story to be written that was less generous than it should have been. He said the kindness he had offered in his quote had not been the real kind. He said he had looked at the building and seen only what it cost and not what it was worth, and that was his limitation and not theirs. Roy said he appreciated that. Briggs asked if there was anything the town could do for the opening without expectation, in the way of a man who understands he is asking rather than offering. Vera came out from the kitchen then. She said she would like the county road crew to look at the Route 9 entrance signage, which was inadequate for the traffic the story had already started generating. She said she had submitted that request in writing 6 weeks ago, and it had not been acted on. Briggs said he would see to it personally before the end of the following week. Vera said she appreciated that. He had coffee, which Vera made for him, and then he left. Roy and Vera stood in the dining room after he was gone, and Roy said that had gone better than expected. Vera said she had expected exactly that. Roy said he knew. The soft opening of the Calloway Diner was held on a Friday evening in the 14th week. They opened 30 seats. Vera had built a menu of 14 items, each designed around what the cold room could hold at its specific temperature and what the land and the season could provide within driving distance of Pell Creek. The menu changed month to month. The cold room held produce at temperatures that preserved flavor in ways mechanical refrigeration did not consistently match, and Vera knew this because she had spent 32 years working around that limitation in a professional kitchen. Every seat was filled. The second Friday had people waiting at the door. By the fourth Friday, Roy had installed a small hand-lettered sign at the entrance to the cold room stairs, visible to seated guests from the counter. Cold Room, 1947. The sign was Roy's own work, cut from a piece of original counter lumber he had saved, and guests asked about it, and Roy or Vera would explain, and the guests who went down came back up with a different expression than the one they had taken below. Nathan came back for the opening weekend. He worked the front of the house with Bet because Vera had asked him to, and he was better at it than any of them had anticipated. At the end of the first Friday evening, he told Roy the glass was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in a restaurant. Roy said he thought so too. Nathan said he understood now, not just the diner, but something he had not been able to see before, about what his parents saw in things and what it had cost them to keep looking when the world was telling them to stop. Roy said that was a generous thing to say. Nathan said he thought he had owed them that for a while. The Calloway Diner on Route 9 was open 5 days a week, Thursday through Monday, dinner service only through the fall and into the winter, expanding to lunch as the season warranted. The parking lot was level and properly signed. The sign above the door said Calloway in the original lettering that Roy had researched from the county archive photograph and had fabricated from the same aluminum stock as the original, because he had found a craftsman in Hartwell who still understood how to work in that tradition. The windows were all glazed and the roof was sound, and the building looked, from the shoulder of Route 9, like a place that had been cared for across its whole life, which was not precisely true, but was becoming truer every month. Vera ran the kitchen with one other cook, a young woman named June who had driven out from Hartwell to ask for a job after reading the Courier story, and who Vera had hired after 15 minutes of conversation, because June had asked about the cold room in her first minute inside the building, and Vera considered that a sufficient interview. Roy had a small workshop set up in the back storage room because there was always something in the building that needed attention, and he liked working in the building, and Vera liked having him there. On a Thursday evening in their third month of service, after the last customer had gone and the cleaning was done and the cold room was loaded for Friday service, Roy and Vera sat together in the last booth near the window. The dining room was quiet and low lit, and the lamp Roy had installed threw the art glass along the counter against the wall in amber and green and deep blue, the colors shifting slightly as the lamp settled. Vera had the notebook. She opened it to a new right-hand page and wrote the date and the number of covers they had served since the opening, and a small drawing of the counter with the glass indicated. She wrote the names of the people who had become part of what the Calloway was: June, Bet, Lou, Nathan, Patricia Holt. She wrote, "Cold Room, 1947, still working." Then she set the notebook on the table between them in the middle, which was where it always went when it was both of theirs. Roy picked up the pen and opened to a left-hand page and sat for a moment. Then he wrote one line. He wrote, "Finally stopped." Vera read what he had written and looked at the counter, and then at Roy. He said he thought they had made something real. She said she had always known they would make something real. He said he knew she had known. He said that was one of the things about her that had never changed in 49 years. She said she could say the same about him, about the way he saw things that were not visible yet, and she had been glad of it every year. Outside, Route 9 was quiet. The last light had gone from the western hills. Inside the Calloway Diner, the lamp Roy had installed cast the old art glass against the far wall, amber and green and deep blue, the way Emmett Calloway had imagined it would cast when he had commissioned it from a glass worker in 1947 and set it into the counter of a diner on a state highway and opened the door and waited to see who would stop. The glass had been waiting 77 years, and now someone had finally stopped. I want to know how Roy and Vera's story sat with you. If it gave you something, leave it in the comments below. Whatever you felt while you were listening belongs there, and I want to read it. Tell me where you are watching from today. This channel reaches further than I sometimes expect, and every location in the comments is a reminder that these stories find the people who need them. And I want to ask you something that Roy and Vera's story keeps asking me. Have you ever looked at something that everyone around you was certain was worthless, and known, without being able to explain it yet, that they were wrong? Not because you had proof, not because anyone was on your side, but because you had put your hands on it, and it had told you something the room could not yet see. Have you ever been Roy standing at that counter, or Vera in that kitchen, or both of them standing in that cold room in the dark with a flashlight and a notebook and 49 years of knowing how to look at things together? Tell us. Tell us what it was and what happened next. I want to know. Thank you for spending time with Roy and Vera and with this channel. The next story is already waiting, and I think it is one you are going to want to hear.